So we're going to techniques behind some of the most successful thought leadership campaigns in the professional services sector. We're going to touch on the way COVID has changed the way firms are using research, some of the techniques being adopted, the segmentation of data, and some of the more common mistakes that that Ben and Jonathan are seeing made. But before I introduce or ask Ben and Jonathan to introduce themselves, just a reminder, as Helen explained, this masterclass is going to run for 15 minutes and we will be very strict on our timing, followed by a further 15 minutes of questions. If you'd like to ask a question, rather than raising your virtual hand, please use the conversation tab on your screen. I will be keeping an eye on those questions and we'll put those to our panelists after our 15 minutes are up. So very briefly, Meridian West are a consultancy to financial and professional services firms. The firm has conducted over 80 thought leadership campaigns. And I think Ben and Jonathan, I think let's introduce yourselves. And Ben, why don't you just say hello and introduce yourself, and then Jonathan.
Oh, hi. Yeah, so I'm Ben Kent. I founded the business 20 years ago, coming up for our birthday. Yeah, and I really enjoy doing thought leadership research. It's kind of fascinating, always new topics, and kind of the combination of research and storytelling is fun to do.
Jonathan.
Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Litterick. I'm a senior consultant at Meridian West. A bit less experienced than Ben. I've been here for about 2 years and I work on a number of thought leadership projects with Meridian.
Done.
So to kick off our very first question, and to Jonathan, I think I'm going to put this one to you. We've got Brexit just weeks away, COVID, we've had an astonishing US election. At the moment, it really does feel sometimes that everything we thought we knew about the world that we've inhabited over the last few years has changed. And sometimes it feels like it changes from one day to the next. I would be really interested to hear from you how you've seen the research landscape change since March, and are firms, for example, adopting different research methods, or is it still very much business as usual?
So I'd say things are becoming much more agile nowadays, particularly since COVID hit, because time is of the essence. The world is changing, as you said, probably quicker than ever, and thought leadership and its delivery needs to reflect that. It's not possible or productive to kind of over-engineer output, to spend months and months deliberating over a project. Hot topics and the content within them are not staying still, and you need to move quickly to reflect that. And taking that into account, we've seen loads more kind of agile creation of thought and delivery of thought leadership, turning projects around in weeks or months rather than 6 to 12 months, which means pulse surveys, short form articles, case studies that can be turned around really quickly. That's not to say the days of kind of longer reports are gone, but it's more important than ever not to drag your heels when doing thought leadership, because everything is moving so quickly.
Ben, how do you actually see that then being translated on the ground to the kinds of campaigns that you're seeing firms adopt and the research methodologies that are underpinning those campaigns?
Yes, I think what we're finding is, because everyone's being agile, we're creating these kind of almost pulse campaigns. So kind of doing research, kind of releasing it every once a quarter, and that's quite good because you can then reflect, what's the top of the agenda at that particular time. So we're doing, creating kind of online panels of respondents that you can go back to, but you need to keep it really short and sharp and kind of to the point. But it works really well because what it means, if you've got a campaign, you can adapt it to a changing environment, and also you can extend it for a year or two. I think the other thing is, I think the kind of core techniques, which is in-depth interviews plus surveys, are still the best combination. Together, they work really well. So the quant is producing the statistics, which is great for press headlines and for benchmarking. And then you do the in-depth interviews to give you the flavour and the kind of so what. But it's changing somewhat. I think on the in-depth interviews, we're doing many of those videos. Then you can turn it into kind of video clips, which is really great, and turning those into sort of case studies. So that's a kind of win-win. It gives the respondent a chance to promote what they've done, but also it makes great copy.
With the pulse surveys, I mean, talk us through, Jonathan. Maybe talk us through how a pulse survey typically operates. Is it a short number of questions? Is there an ideal sample size? How long do you leave these surveys open for? Just give us a flavour of how they're working.
I mean, it's very much how long is a piece of string, but I would say in general, you want to have a short number of questions. A lot of the pulse surveys that we do, we have campaigns where we will, for example, check in with respondents, quarterly or just periodically. The way that we design them is having them short and interesting and kind of building on a data set over a set period of time. In terms of number of respondents, that depends on the context, but 50 to 150 is usually pretty impactful.
Yeah. Ben, one of the things we heard last week in the masterclass was the need to have really solid planning before you start on a campaign. Yeah. I mean, I wonder, what do firms need to think about with regards to their research, and what do they need to start thinking about before they design the questionnaires, design the research methodologies?
Yeah, I think absolutely right. I think the success or failure comes from that initial planning. So we run these workshops called the Ideas Lab, and one technique which we find works really well is to almost build up the hypothesis or the story you want to achieve. That so almost imagining forward, say, okay, let's imagine this thought leadership report. What's the headline? Almost what the chapter headings are, and then what you can do is you can design the research. Say, here we need a really statistic here, or we would like a case study here. Now, obviously, and that gives you great clarity then to make sure that the research is really targeted and you're not wasting questions. Now, obviously, you're very happy if your hypothesis is proven, but that discipline up front of mapping out the story and the research inputs is tremendously helpful.
Yeah, I would agree. I'd say that all of the most successful campaigns that we've done, you start with a clear campaign plan, hypothesis, storyboarding, all in mind. Going and doing some research without properly planning what you're actually going to do with the research is setting yourself up to fail.
I think the other thing to do is not just think about, increasingly thought leadership is used as a catalyst for conversation, in this virtual environment. So almost imagining what sort of conversation do you want with clients, and also how it links to how you can help. Yeah, sounds obvious, but actually that's really helpful in terms of cutting out the kind of nice to know stuff.
It's about instilling a discipline, I guess, in the research and the methodologies and the stories and outputs that you want to build, and having that discipline at the beginning and sticking to it as well. I mentioned earlier you've been involved in over 80 campaigns. Have you seen any change over the last few months of how firms are approaching research? You've mentioned the pulse surveys. Are you seeing other things coming out of the research methodologies that firms are using? I mean, for example, we've seen some quite interesting sort of video case studies that are actually coming out of the interview process rather than as a follow-up to the data collection.
Yeah, I think the video interviews are terrific. I think also capturing the kind of partner's perspective as part of the campaign is really helpful. So we're doing a project for a law firm at Life Sciences, and so what we're doing is essentially a virtual roundtable with the partners with their perspective on AI in life sciences, for example, recording and capturing that, and that then creates part of the input into the white papers that we're producing. So I think in some ways the lockdown has been very good for thought leadership. It's forced us to be quite creative, to get on with it, and to be almost quite journalistic, kind of spotting the trends and responding quite quickly. And I think the other thing which has been good is a lot of creativity in how you communicate it. So moving away from these kind of long reports towards using videos, microsites. And we've had a lot of interesting, always these diagnostic tools that you can put on your website, and people can take a quiz and it tells them where they stand on a particular issue versus their peer group. So it's quite interesting time as of giving us license to experiment.
Jonathan, are you finding that people are as willing to engage in research now? For example, conducting a series of sort of in-depth interviews, you're looking at asking for an hour of people's times when they're quite busy. Have you found when people are working from home, they're more willing to give up that time?
Yes, we have actually, which we were initially quite surprised by. So when COVID hit, we were expecting response rates for online and in-depth research to plummet, but actually that didn't happen at all. So in fact, this year we probably had better response rates than we ever have. People, I think people are maybe a little bit lonely and like the kind of human interaction that they get from participating in research like this.
And presumably, Ben, the subject is the key. It's got to be a interesting, relevant, and engaging theme to secure the good interviewees.
I think that's right, and I think people are tired of COVID. But I think what's interesting is there's a lot of kind of big picture themes. CEOs are really thinking quite strategically, long term. So ESG, digital transformation, the kind of rise of populism. So there's a lot of engagement around that. But I think that the key is, because these are quite attractive topics, is to find the interesting angle, things that haven't been said before. And I think that's the art of designing good questions, is kind of what's the story behind the story, and challenging when you're doing the interview, people not just giving you kind of pat answers about, oh yes, as a business we're interested in ESG, but finding out what they're really doing. And that's, I suppose, some of the art of thought leadership.
One of the a question is how you can segment data. So people will quite understand it's quite easy to segment quant data, but how can you do that with qual data, if you can at all? And actually, when you're designing a campaign, is it how should you choose the kind of data that you're going to be collecting? Ben, what do you think?
I think if you want to do segmentation, I think, to be honest, going down the quant route is better than qual. But I think that the big four are very good at this. They will do big global campaigns, and then they have the overarching report, the future of tax, say, but then they will segment it. So you say tax within TMT, tax within automotive, tax within the US, tax within the UK. So that means out of one campaign, you're getting up to 15 kind of sub campaigns. You can do it with in-depth interviews, as we worked on a project where we did looking at finance across the different jurisdictions. But I think if you do that, you need to kind of supplement it with desk research and kind of freely available statistics to give it, so you can really talk sensibly about how each segment differs.
And Jonathan, sorry, I was going to say, if you've got anything to contribute as well. Yeah.
Read my mind, Matt. So I mean, one thing that we've noticed, particularly this year, is that people are leaning a lot more towards kind of snackable outputs. And in using segmentation, what you do is, from one data set, you can really drive engagement by doing country spotlights, industry spotlights, case studies, things like that are easier to produce and really impactful for kind of driving engagement in your campaign, and dives into what's going to be of particular interest to a particular audience.
I think we're fast approaching our 15 minutes, so I've got one final question for you both. What are the mistakes that you're seeing firms make at the moment? Are they the same as they've always been, or are firms sort of leaping before they look and do the planning? So Ben, any mistakes that people are making and should avoid? And then Jonathan.
I think two things. I think having too many cooks involved in designing the questionnaire, particularly lots of partners, makes it become the big, shaggy, amorphous, unfocused project trying to please everyone. I think the second is, it's easy to say, okay, we'll do an online survey and push it out to our clients, and being way too optimistic on the response rate you get. and sometimes you come unstuck and you're really trying to push it. So I think much better to go to a paid for panel, and then you can pretty much guarantee the response rate.
And my 2 cents. So I think going back to what Ben said previously, so conducting research without having your end goal in mind, not planning effectively, is something that always happens and still happens, unfortunately. And also, one common error I've noticed is not engaging effectively with internal stakeholders. So when you're doing a thought leadership campaign, a huge part of it is going to be you're working with your relationship partners and kind of key accounts teams who are going to engage using the thought leadership campaign with your clients. But actually, if someone just has something plonked in their inbox, it's all already done. It's like, go and speak to your clients about this. They're not going to really be that engaged with it. But if they're involved in the kind of design and planning process, then they will.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's probably the biggest mistake, actually. And actually building into the process engagement with the partners so they feel super comfortable about going to talk to their clients about it, and spoon feeding with drafting emails for them, drafting agenda points, etc. is really can work really well.
And getting that kind of engagement from internal stakeholders makes a more successful campaign as well.
Yeah.
It makes it more interesting.
Jonathan, we're slightly over our 15 minutes. That's bad chairing from me. I do apologise. We do have a few questions starting to come in. So the first one has come up from around panels and how a panel. I'm a big fan of panels. If you can build a successful panel that you can turn to time and time again, it's a great way of building in some terrific data. But how do you actually? What's the best way to approach a panel interview? Building a panel, rather. How do you build that panel? How do you maintain engagement and enthusiasm with that panel, presumably over quite a long period of time? Any thoughts, Jonathan?
I think building a panel is super helpful when you're doing thought leadership, but it's also pretty difficult. There's a lot of things that you need to be wary of. So going back regularly to a community that you've built is really helpful, but you need to keep them sweet. You need to give them a reason for engaging in your project. If you're talking about a 12, 24-month period, their interest might wane. So you need to give them an incentive, whether that's benchmarking or sometimes there's financial incentives. You need to give them a reason for taking part. I think you need to be conscious of skews and kind of demographics. So often if we're working with firms that are trying to build a panel of their own clients, if you're a UK based firm and you're doing an international project, you're going to have a UK skew. So often we would top up panels to ensure that we have a good mix of respondents. But as I said, it's quite a difficult thing to do. So it's very difficult for a firm to do it by themselves, I would say.
And Ben, when it's done phenomenally well. A good example would be PwC's CEO Pulse, quarterly Pulse. It's a panel that I don't know they've built. Do you have to keep the panel static? Can you introduce new panel members? Ask panel members to drop out?
You try and keep people on the panel as much as possible. You try and top it up each year. People sort of buy into it. But the key is to kind of keep the topics super interesting, so on purpose or cryptocurrencies or things that people want to take part. And I think also, giving people a kind of preview of the results pretty soon afterwards is a way of achieving that.
Another question has come in from Helen. So, looking at the best way to approach deep dive interviews, would you, for example, share questions in advance with those people that you're interviewing? Should you have the client, a partner or fee earner participating in a deep dive interview? What's your recommendations, Ben, on sort of that approach with deep dives?
I think the best practice is you want to make the respondent feel as comfortable as possible. And so I think giving them an agenda beforehand is really helpful. It helps them feel comfortable with the process, particularly for lawyers, I must say. They like to see that. I think also the interviewer needs to both have kind of some pretty strong domain expertise in the area. So, understand, whatever it's on private equity, but also be a really skilled interviewer. In terms of having partners kind of involved, we've done that on a number of projects. It works really well, but I think you need to be really clear about what the role is. So I think probably have the researcher as the lead interviewer, but there's real benefit in having the partner there to ask the technical questions, and also the partners. You learn so much from actually hearing the clients talking. So they love it, absolutely love it.
Sure. Yeah, I would agree. I think having a partner involved, certainly has a real impact, and it's really good for building the relationship as well. And also, they are going to be the subject matter specialists and can often, ask the difficult questions that an interviewer might not think of, or kind of technical questions.
When actually choosing your interviewers, is there any advice that you can give there? Because there's actually a market researcher who can read off a crib sheet, but actually they're not going to necessarily spot the gaps between questions and the answers that pose further questions. So what do you when you're sort of think, how should you choose the right person to do the interview? Do you want a journalist that could be quite aggressive? Do you want sort of a happy medium between a journalist and a market researcher? What's your thoughts there?
I would say the best interviewers are always people who can engage in kind of free-flowing conversations. So if you're just reading a list of questions, you're not going to get, you're going to get answers to those questions, but you're not going to get much enthusiasm from the interview subject. You need to have people who know what they're talking about, they're comfortable talking about it, and they're going to actually engage with the people being interviewed. Anything to add, Ben?
No, I think I think the idea was a researcher, but also someone, if you can, who's worked in that industry. So we have a panel of kind of interviewers, many who've worked in financial services or ex-lawyers or ex-accountants, and that's the perfect combination, I think.
Yeah. Just a reminder, if anybody wants to pose any questions, please do. The chat function is open. I have another question. It's sort of how do you sort of capture internal knowledge within a firm as part of that interview process? As you mentioned, Jonathan, the partners, fee earners, they will be the subject matter experts quite often. And can those internal audiences be used to supplement external research? Have you seen any examples of that working well?
I would say, yeah, absolutely. I think it's always really valuable to capture the internal perspective. The reason people are doing thought leadership 99% of the time is to kind of showcase their firm's capabilities in a certain area, and having hearing from the horse's mouth from a partner who knows exactly what they're talking about is super helpful. We do find often partners can be reluctant to kind of put pen to paper on recommendations, for risk of being controversial, and they don't want to offer advice that people might not like. So we find interviewing partners and kind of synthesizing that for the purposes of thought leadership often works very well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree, and I think partners are often quite reluctant to offer a point of view, which is a real shame. I think we've done some projects where we did a project with Grant Thornton looking at sale and purchase agreements and valuation mechanisms. And so we did a benchmarking exercise to use what mechanism people were using, produce a research report, but then it had kind of accompanying Grant Thornton points of view on the sort of technical, and that worked super well. And there was it spun off a whole series of technical papers, but based on the research. And that really, I think, presented GT in a kind of, as real experts.
Mm. And one final question, and this is from me rather than from any of our other guests here, but I have come across examples of firms thinking that their own marketing and BD teams can do the research themselves. And in a few cases, actually, partners and fee earners thinking that they're best placed to do the research. Have you ever come across that? And could you see any problems arising out of that model of doing the research? Ben?
I think picking your team is really important for thought leadership, and I think the best is a kind of combination of different talents. So we did a project again, for a Big Four firm, it was looking at the next generation of leaders in family businesses, and it was terrific. We had the main partner, we had the marketeers from all around the world, we had designers there, we had the journalists there. Everyone brings their own kind of perspective to it, and I think that works super well.
Bringing in a balance of people rather than relying on any one individual. Sounds like sensible advice to me. Well, I think unless there are any further questions, and it doesn't look like they are, we're almost at our allotted 30 minutes. So unless there are any other questions, why don't we wrap it up here?